Picture this: raw, scraping metal, the staccato bark of distant gunfire, and a tide of steel beasts sweeping toward you through a ruined alien outpost. That adrenaline, that hunger to keep moving, that's Quake II, but not on a souped-up gaming PC. This is Quake II on the PlayStation, a late 90s experiment in translating blistering PC mayhem to a console built for disk loading and triangle budgets. Today we're tearing into the port, the compromises, the clever tricks, and the moments where console limitations actually made the game feel different, but still vicious. Let's jump in. On PC, Quake II was a brutal, tightly tuned first-person shooter, heavy weapons, chunky enemies, and arena designs that pushed engines and players the same way. The PS1 version had to take that identity and squeeze it into a very different machine. A chip that loved triangles, slow memory, and a CD drive that politely reminded you it existed every time a new area loaded. The question the port faced wasn't whether Quake II could run on PlayStation. It was whether the PlayStation could still deliver that sense of speed, weight, and tactical danger that defined the original. Technically, this is where the conversation gets juicy. The PlayStation's GPU is fixed function and prefers smaller, textured triangles. PCs, meanwhile, were starting to lean on more memory, higher resolutions, and the precision of mouse aiming. To keep frame rates somewhat stable, the PS1 port needed aggressive polygon reduction, lower res textures, and design changes that limited the number of enemies on screen. You'll notice immediate differences: flatter, blockier geometry, texture pop as new surfaces stream in, and fog or darkness used as a deliberate curtain to hide draw distance. Audio also went through adaptation. Some weapon impacts and ambient sound effects were downsampled or looped more aggressively, but the CD format allowed for richer music cues and cinematic tracks that landed with surprising punch for the system. Those are the obvious trade-offs. What's more interesting is how the porters preserved the feel. Impact sounds were emphasized, camera recoil tuned for the controller, and level funnels redesigned to keep fights manageable within the PlayStation's processing window. Mapping a mouse-driven shooter to a gamepad is never simple. The PlayStation's D-pad and DualShock sticks demand concessions. Auto-aim, aim assist windows, and forgiving hitboxes become part of the equation. On Quake II PS1 you can still strafe and circle strafing works, but the mechanical precision that made PC speedruns devastatingly efficient gets softened. What the port achieves instead is accessibility. Fights become more about movement rhythm and weapon choice than pixel-perfect headshots. The DualShock's rumble, if supported on the bundle, and the tactile feedback of reloads and explosions actually add visceral presence that a mouse click can't give you seated on the couch. Levels on the PS1 version are surgical edits of their PC counterparts. Wide, sprawling arenas were often tightened, sightlines shortened, some enemy spawns reduced, and tricky platforming simplified. Why? The console needed predictable CPU cycles and fewer simultaneous ASH to avoid catastrophic frame collapse. That change in scale shifts player strategy. On PC, you might kite an enemy through a massive room. On PS1 you get an intimate, claustrophobic firefight where corners and choke points dominate. It's almost a redesign tactic. Instead of replicating the PC exactly, the port rewrites encounters so they still challenge the player under the new constraints. The PlayStation couldn't compute advanced dynamic lighting like a high-end PC renderer, so the team leaned on art tricks. Reused texture palettes, baked lighting, and cleverly placed sprite effects gave the impression of depth and atmosphere without rendering a million dynamic lights. Fog wasn't just a technical limitation anymore. It became a mood device, hiding the horizon and forcing the player to focus on the immediate. Enemies also shifted from detailed models to a combination of simplified geometry and layered sprites for distant foes. When the camera gets close, those limitations vanish, and that's where the game still feels satisfying. Close quarters, the gun weight, hit reactions, and explosive feedback remain visceral. Audio is one area where the console surprisingly shines. The CD audio allowed for richer, more atmospheric tracks. The bass of the soundtrack, compressed voice cues and ambient loops all helped sell scale. Even if some SFX lost fidelity, the overall mix on a living room sound system could feel larger than life. Quake II PS1 uses that to its advantage. Atmospheric pulses and sudden musical swells make the small screen fights feel cinematic. No port is perfect. Expect frame rate dips in intense rooms, long disk loads between big areas, and occasional pop in where the engine prioritizes geometry. But alongside those frustrations are quirks that give the PS1 port its own personality. The way explosions stagger the camera, the occasional enemy behavior that feels odd but memorable, and moments where hardware constraints produce emergent challenge. One thing to watch. The balance of certain weapons and enemies changes just enough that some strategies from the PC simply don't translate. That forces the player to improvise, often with satisfying results. Is the PS1 Quake II the definitive experience? No, that crown belongs to the original PC release. But it's a fascinating historical document, a snapshot of what it looked like to bring cutting-edge PC shooters into the living room in the late 90s. For preservationists and fans of console conversions, it's a masterclass in trade-offs, and for new players, it's a compact, raw, bruising shooter with a distinct flavor. Play it to see how nostalgia interacts with hardware, to feel the weight of analog input, to accept fog and texture limits as art, and to appreciate little design changes that unintentionally create new playstyles. So next time you load Quake II on the PlayStation, don't look for a slavish recreation. Look for a reinterpretation, a console translation that keeps the game's aggressive heart while bending its limbs to fit new bones. Tell me, what runs better in your memory, the brutal speed of the PC, or the couch-side chaos of the PS1? Drop a comment with your favorite weird port moment.